Welcome, everybody, to today's case study and dialogue on land return, which is one of several educational opportunities we from the Nuns and Nuns Land Justice team have planned for you this fall semester. Brittany Cutellis and Sarah Jane Bradley from the Nuns and Nuns team are calling in from a retreat in Albuquerque, outside Albuquerque, or Santa Fe, New Mexico. And I'm here from the Land Justice team as well as Eric and Galata making an appearance for some tech support. We're all really thrilled that you're here with us today as part of this learning community as we dive ever more deeply into both the spiritual discernment behind and some of the nuts and bolts that go into land transitions rooted in land justice. Our Land Justice Project, the Nuns and Nuns Land Justice Project, works with religious communities and movement partners to create land transitions that are rooted in both ecological and racial healing. And as part of that work, we offer these ongoing educational opportunities to more deeply inform the work of land justice. So we understand land justice to have three important components: protecting land from extraction, regenerating the health of the land, and expanding land equity to Black, Indigenous, and other dispossessed communities. The practice of land justice we understand as involving centering ecological, social, and racial justice in decisions about how land is used, loved, and governed by people. And so our fall curriculum features a variety of formats to explore the myriad ways that this can look, which will include case studies of land transitions that are rooted in a land justice ethic, like our program today. And we also offer in-depth trainings, like the two-part training on cultural sensitivity in land transitions that's coming up in 2 weeks. And we'll have more on that at the end of the webinar today. A few technical reminders before we get started. We'd like to remind you to stay muted throughout the interview today out of respect for our speakers. And if you have any trouble with that, we can help you. And if you're having technical difficulties, please feel free to chat Sarah Bradley for assistance. Also, if you have questions that come up that you'd like to see us pose to our guest speakers during the Q&A at the end of today's program, please send your questions to Sarah, and we'll do our best to get to it. A few helpful buttons for you today on your screens. If you'd like to see the closed captioning for today's program, just click on the live transcript or CC button at the bottom of your screen. And if those captions are distracting to you, you can also click the hide subtitle in your Zoom toolbar. If you can't find a button that you're looking for, you can try clicking on the More button, and what you're looking for should appear for you. We're grateful to have with us today Michelle Shenandoah and Leslie Haynes, women from both sides of a recent land transition in what's now called Clinton, New York. In 2018, Haynes, who's a Quaker, returned 30 acres of land that she had inherited from family to the Oneida people by donating it to a nonprofit led by Oneida women from each of the 3 Oneida communities in Canada, New York, and Wisconsin. The name of the nonprofit in Oneida means "we work together." And this group of women who had been separated for over 200 years due to colonization and forced removal was looking for land on which they could be together, practice their language, grow their own foods, and strengthen their relationships among the nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And though I recently learned that Michelle is no longer officially a part of that particular nonprofit, she was really a vital part of that initial relationship building and continues to work for the rematriation of her people's lands. So we've invited Michelle and Leslie here to speak about the importance of this rematriation of land, the spiritual roots and moral discernment, and some of the legal steps surrounding this particular land transition, and also just about how their own relationship has grown throughout this process. So it's my enormous pleasure to introduce to you Michelle Shenandoah, an inspirational speaker, writer, and traditional member of the Oneida Nation Wolf Clan of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Michelle is the founder of Rematriation Magazine, a Haudenosaunee-led digital storytelling platform connecting Haudenosaunee and Indigenous women across Turtle Island and around the world. Raised in a family of traditional leadership, Michelle carries the values and responsibilities of being a Haudenosaunee woman throughout her life. Inspired by her grandmothers, who led generations of Oneida Nation land claims, Michelle carries her ancestors' passion to rematriate her people's lands and bring about the truthful telling of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy's influence in the world. Last spring, Michelle presented as a spiritual advisor to Pope Francis in the First Nations delegation to the Vatican, which prompted his apology regarding residential schools. Michelle is also co-founder, owner, and principal at Indigenous Concepts Consulting with her husband, Neil Powless. They help business and media companies develop their own organizational best practices through an Indigenous value-based lens. So welcome, Michelle. We're so grateful that you could be with us here today. And I'm wondering if you might begin as the founder of Rematriation Magazine, maybe speaking a bit about what you mean by rematriation in general and what that means to you as an Oneida person, however you'd like to take that.
Sure, thank you. Well, it's a real honor to be here today. Thank you. I do apologize from calling from my car, but it just happened to be the only place I could be here uninterrupted today because my office space was just filled with a lot of people. So I hope you can all hear me okay. Okay, good. All right. So yeah, and it's great to be here with Lisa Lee and to share this story. I'm honored that you asked me to be here. And so, yeah, rematriation. The word is really centered in traditional midwifery and Indigenous traditional midwifery. So when a child is born, you know, all of the elements that bring the child into the world, from the placenta and the umbilical cord, and all of this is returned back into the earth. And there's a direct connection between women and Mother Earth in our worldview, and the life-giving qualities that allow for life to continue. And so this concept was being called rematriation. And we had one of the clan mothers from our communities starting to really use rematriation in other forms and other areas and other, you know, work that she was doing. And so she was using it in terms of governance, in terms of how our women walk in the world, how our people walk in the world, how we have relationship with Mother Earth, and how we as human beings should be conducting ourselves. And I started to talk with her more about this and understanding its roots in traditional midwifery, but in terms of how she started to expand on that concept, I said, you know, let's make sure that this makes its way into becoming a real definition. And let's get this into the dictionary. I want this to become a usable word. And so we're still in that process. It's up on Wiki Dictionary, but it's not yet in Merriam-Webster. So we got to work on that one. But what I did is I had her explain to me, I said, tell me about your concept of rematriation. What does it mean? And we were on the phone for about a good half an hour, 45 minutes, and she went really high in the sky with, you know, how she felt about it. I said, great. I said, give me just a little bit of time and I'll call you back. So I spent time with her definition, and then I also looked at the word repatriation, and that definition is returning a person or object back to its original country or owner. And, you know, it's rooted in patriarch, right? To repatriate. And so as I started looking at her definition, the concept of rematriation, I came up with the definition of returning the sacred to the mother, and, you know, honoring the traditional roots of midwifery, and then the concepts that she was looking to have through her use of the word rematriation, and created this definition. And with that, I also then asked if she would be okay with me using this name for the work that I was doing. And I launched Rematriation magazine originally in 2019. I started working on it in 2016, but came about to launching it in 2019. And since I've, the organization and the work itself has evolved. And so we've kind of dropped rematriation, and now we're just calling our organization Rematriation, and really focused on uplifting Indigenous women's voice and working with the public to build allyship and to really all work together in terms of our relationship with Mother Earth, because we're at this critical juncture where we all really have to be mindful of that relationship, because otherwise there may not be a future for humankind. And so we really work to elevate Indigenous women and Indigenous people's wisdom to the public. We work on building allyship. What does that look like? Creating space to hear from each other, work together, and also, still helping to support Indigenous women action within our communities, so that the work that we do can, and the messages that we're sharing can have far reach, and to support the important work that's going on within our communities as well. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that definition is beautiful, and hopefully that becomes sort of a common phrase. People know rematriation, returning the sacred to the mother. Thank you. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how the particular land that that you worked with Leslie on doing a land return, how that came about, and the nonprofit We Work Together, which I'll let you say the name in Oneida if you'd like.
Yeah.
And how that came about, and how you went about looking for land, and why, and how that relates to rematriation. Thanks.
Well, it's a bit of a long story, and so I'll do my best to try to pull it all together and be brief, so we can share all of the details. But I think it's important to know the threads. And so among the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, we're 6 nations that are located currently from as far as Montreal in Quebec in Canada, out to Green Bay, Wisconsin, and all throughout. And then we do have some relatives that went all the way out to Kansas. And so our traditional territories as the Haudenosaunee span across New York State and up into Canada. But throughout time, our people were pushed out through wars, through settlements, through illegal takings of our land, broken treaties. And so if you take a look at a map today of Haudenosaunee territories, you'll see what was, once this, very big area where we were all very connected and where we lived, now are just these like little tiny small pockets that are like spread out throughout those areas that I just described, from Montreal to Green Bay and down even into Kansas. And knowing that the land was illegally taken, our people's history is long. We have, oral traditions and histories that, we hear growing up over and over and over again. And so when you hear something over and over and over again, it becomes part of your knowledge. You share that generationally. And, it's been, said and noted even by Benjamin Franklin about how our women in particular were basically like our knowledge keepers, and would know the details of treaty agreements from 100 years prior that even colonists had forgot those details that went along with those treaties. And so I guess where I'm going is that our people knew that our lands had been illegally taken, and the Oneidas in particular had helped George Washington during the Revolutionary War to win the war, to make this country, America. And for that, Washington had always promised that Oneida lands would be forever protected. And that did not end up being the case. And in fact, out of all the Haudenosaunee, the Oneidas end up having the greatest land loss out of any of the Haudenosaunee Six Nations. And New York State in particular was one of those entities that had illegally taken land from the Oneidas. So prior to the 1950s, as Indigenous peoples, nations, tribes, bands, whatever, whatever it is that we've come to call ourselves to this day, did not have any type of legal recourse for our lands being taken. We couldn't go to the court. We didn't have any ability to have standing in the courts, and that prevented us from being able to bring anything. So prior to the 1950s, we didn't have an opportunity to say, hey, our land was illegally taken, even though we held on to that history. We knew that. So when the 50s came around and those doors opened, my great-grandmother, Mary Cornelius Winder, and another group of Oneidas, but she kind of really led the charge. And her sister had also joined her, but you'll see there's a lot of letters that she wrote to the US government. She traveled between 3 communities of Oneida. So the Oneidas, our original homelands, are in our territories in what's now people will call New York State, and where Lisa Lee also is situated. But our people were forced out and removed. So a lot of our people moved out to Green Bay, Wisconsin, and then there's another settlement that is in Canada, in London, Ontario. My family is some of those who stayed behind in our home territories. But my grandmother would travel between, my great-grandmother would travel between all those communities, working with Oneidas to try to get us to be of some consensus and wanting to get our lands back and writing to the courts. Well, she ultimately got our case into the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, yes, Oneidas, this is legitimately your land. New York State, you illegally took it, but now we're going to send it back to you, and you have to settle with the Oneidas. So that went on for about 50 years. And I was born right in the middle of it, because New York State only wanted to just pay what the value of the land was when they took it. And as Oneida people, we didn't want money. It didn't matter what amount they put on it. It was about the land and the land use. And so New York State just never wanted to give it up. So years went by, all kinds of negotiations, court processes, etc. And eventually what ended up happening is that our nation ended up buying land back. And in one particular area, we, our leadership had made the decision that rather than paying the land tax, because as sovereign nations, we don't pay taxes on our land, rather than paying the tax, what they did as a nice gesture to the city, the local city, is they gave a gift, a financial gift, and said, okay, here, in lieu of taxes, we're going to give you a financial gift. And they were approximately about the same. But the city said, and the residents said, no, we don't accept this because you're avoiding paying tax, and we're not happy with that. So they took us to court. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the decision came back in 2005, which was the city of Sherrill versus Oneida Nation. And the case, which had been written by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, was not a pretty one. And it was very detrimental to not only just the Oneidas, but for all Haudenosaunee in New York State to it closed the doors forever on our land claims in all of New York State. That's it, done forever. And it was a really very racist and prejudicial case against the Oneidas and against all the Haudenosaunee nations. It was my very first year of law school, because when I was a little kid, like I said, I was born when this was all ripe and going on, and my grandmother is a clan mother, and I would go to all these meetings and be there, and I said, oh, when I get older, I want to work on these land claim cases, and I'm going to go become a lawyer. And I just was very inspired by my grandmother, my great grandmother, my mom, right? It's just all these generations that had worked on our land claims cases. And so my very first year of law school, all of a sudden, boom, doors were shut. Like, that's it. No more land claims cases. And I was like, wow, okay, so what do I do now? So I stayed in law school, I finished. And then when I got out, I got a second law degree, and I focused in on tax law, because we also happen to have a lot of interesting tax cases with our whole non-taxable status. But anyway, so things came around. My life took a little bit of a different turn. I didn't end up practicing law in the conventional sense of what we understand lawyering. But my mother always did remind me. She said, Michelle, if you become a lawyer, you're agreeing to uphold the U.S. law, which she said, how can you fight for our people if you are agreeing to uphold laws that are really designed to harm us, to eliminate us? And she said, you're agreeing that you will uphold those laws. And she said, you have to remember, as Haudenosaunee people, we have our own laws. And so life just kind of brought it around that way. And so now I'm doing the work that I do now. And so I've been asked to speak quite a bit. I do a lot of public speaking, and I was invited to attend a Quaker meeting. What year was that, Lisa Lee? That was 2018, I think, maybe. And it was about there?
Up there.
17,
17.
something like that. Yeah. And I worked with one of the historians, one of the Quaker historians, and I was going to share something, then he was going to share something, but we ended up doing this pre-conversation before the actual talk, and we ended up having these really insightful, like, wild conversations where we realized like some things about history that were like, wow, that's a conversation for another time. So we decided what we would do would have this kind of sharing dialogue exchange during the presentation. And I just knew like instinctively that I had to bring up the work that I was doing with a lot of our women, our Haudenosaunee women. And one of those, because I always knew that even though the doors were closed on our land claims, like I started to see more kind of happening. Those are kind of the very early beginnings of what we're seeing, like in terms of now, like we see all these land back, things are going. So this was kind of at the very early stage, and I'm paying attention to them because I knew there's something else is going to transpire. And so I'm paying attention to it. I'm watching it, and I believe, and I know in our heart, in my heart, that something different is going to happen. And so the work I was doing was really helping to unite a lot of our women from across the whole Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And we started to come together in healing and ceremony for like days on end. And what was happening was that the Oneida women from all three communities were also starting to come together at these gatherings that we were doing. And we said, we want to be together in our homelands, right? Because some of them, they've been gone since the early 1800s, and they hadn't even had their feet on the homelands, right? And I believe that like our spiritual umbilical cord ties us to the land of where we're from. So for them coming back to the land was really significant. And we wanted to be together. We wanted a place where we could like have, when I talk about our ceremonies together, our ceremonies are about giving thanks. It's about giving thanks to the land, giving thanks to the food, giving thanks to all that sustains us. And we wanted to be able to be together in ceremony. And because of the politics that happened among our communities, some of the women didn't feel safe coming back to our home territories. They had received threats in the past from other community members. And so we just tried to like stay away from kind of the big community, and we went off into like other park areas, you know, parks that were significant to our people. And we kind of had our own ceremonies of giving thanks and being together. And I realized, I'm like, we need land of our own that, you know, is united between all of our people, where we can come together, we can feel safe, where we can feel like, you know, we can be together. And so I had that intention, and I started to share it with our other Oneida women, and some of us even started to take up a little bit of a collection. I still have an envelope with about, I don't know, $150 in it, I think, and or I think that's how much, or 51. I don't know. I know 1 and a 5 is in there, but anyways, we all put our money in, and you know, we sealed it up, and you know, this is for our Oneida, you know, land. And they said, we're going to buy our land back if that's what we have to do. And so when I went to this meeting, I just knew that night I needed to talk about this. So I brought it up and I shared it. And, you know, I didn't know where it would go. And lo and behold, afterwards, Lisa Lee comes up to me and she says, you know, that, you know, Oneida, you know, women's land that you talked about, she said, you know, I have land in Oneida territory, and I'd like to give it, you know, to the Oneida women. And I was speechless. I was, you know, I didn't really quite know what to say, because you never really, you know, when something manifests before your eyes, sometimes, you know, as magical as it might feel, sometimes you just sort of like, wow, like I'm not sure what I'm supposed to say or what I'm supposed to do. And I was just like, I was speechless, actually. And so we exchanged information, and I stayed over that night in Rochester. And the next day on my drive home, I really remember just having this really clear like feeling, and I could just feel, you know, the work of like my great grandmother and my grandmother and my family. I felt them really close to me. And I just, you know, was like, wow, like I never even needed to go to law school. Like it just happened. Like here's actual land back. And so that's kind of how that came to be. I mean, there's all kinds of other details that, you know, happen, you know, in terms of how that actually, you know, then came to actually happen and transpire beyond that, from a legal perspective. But that's really the, you know, from my, my perspective in terms of how those came together, how, you know, that came to be.
Thank you. I was just getting goosebumps at the end there as you were sharing this story. It's really beautiful. It's clear that this land back, returning the land, rematriation is like a spiritual, it's like a source of spiritual, ecological healing. And yeah, you described that so well. And we just have a few minutes before I want to hear kind of from Leslie's point of view, but if you'd be willing to actually share some of those legal nuts and bolts. I think Leslie had maybe shared with me that you created a nonprofit. How did that actually work? Because some of the folks on the call, I think today, are interested in how that actually works.
You know, I know that there's different types of things that are happening out there, and I think it really sort of depends on the situation that best suits, you know, the people, the land, the history, the contemporary issues that might, you know, be presented. So I think it really has to go case by case. So you know, with my legal background, you know, there's lawyers who I'm friends with, who I've worked with, and I reached out to them. One of the things, you know, like I had mentioned, political, you know, issues and concerns, you know, among our 3 different communities. One of the things that we were very aware of, and also Lisa Lee was very aware of, was the political climate within my own home community and our homeland. And we have a lot of economic development, and it was, you know, very important for Lisa Lee that the land not be developed in that way, where there's, you know, gas stations and casino and all this kind of stuff, right? And I don't blame her, because the land there is beautiful. And I want to say this before we get too far onto it, but you can look up, there's an article, it's on Indian Country Today. And if you Google like Indian Country Today, Oneida women speak 200 years, the article will come up and it will tell you about this story. It's a really great in-depth article that, you know, also interviews the women, you know, who were involved in all of this. And, you know, what's interesting and what I really wanted to share was that, you know, when we first went to the land, you know, we sang, and as Oneida women, you know, touching the land and realizing that the songs and our dances like hadn't been on those lands in over 200 years. And like being able to reconnect with the land, like the spiritual connection to that is just really powerful, really very moving. And, you know, the land has really just been mostly agricultural land, and some of it's been also like, you know, untouched, you know, land where maybe there was some woods and things like that. But it just felt really, really important. It wasn't like we were reconnecting with somewhere that, you know, is you know, a parking lot or something, you know, where, you know, it's land back. It was just, you know, it just felt kind of very natural, I guess is the way to say it. And it was just kind of like a family reunion, right? Because for us, the land and our relationship to it is family. And it has a long memory, even longer than ours. And so it was just really nice to have that reconnection. But you know, taking a look at what worked best for us was to actually not give the land back directly to the nation, but rather to give the land to the women in the name of all the women from all three Oneida communities. And one of the easiest ways to achieve that was to be able to create a non-for-profit organization that the land could officially be transferred in title to. And then it also created a non-taxable status for the land. And so that was for us sort of the easiest way to be able to do that. We decided not to do a trust because in New York State, a trust cannot continue to exist in perpetuity. So it could not go on forever, whereas a nonprofit could. So those are just some kind of like the little technical pieces in that regard.
Thank you. That's really helpful to hear that that's how you went about it, and it's probably going to be unique to each situation. And as communities discern maybe doing something similar, yeah, the land justice team, we work with technical experts, including legal experts and real estate agents who are specializing in this area. So it's going to be different, I think, depending on each situation. Well, thanks. I'm going to be bringing you back up here in a minute so that you and Lisa Lee can speak some more, and then Q&A, some more can come out. I'm so grateful for all you shared. And I wonder if, Lisa Lee, I would love to hear a little more of your story. And maybe I'll just say a few words of introduction that Lisa Lee gave me in her biography. Lisa Lee Haynes is a lifelong Quaker and a mother and grandmother who worked as a registered nurse in both maternity and hospice until her retirement in 2019. In recent years, she's developed a spiritual practice that has led her to closer relationship to the land on which she has lived for 46 years. And though she grew up on the lands of the Ramapo Lenape Nation and the Hudson River Valley, she says she was barely aware of the original inhabitants of these lands until she started working with the neighbors of the Onondaga Nation, NOON, and other groups. And together with her partner, Buffy Curtis, Lisa Lee has presented several dozen workshops on the doctrine of discovery to non-Native audiences. Thank you, Lisa Lee, so much for agreeing to be with us today. And yeah, could you please share some of your story of how this land transition of 30 acres came about? We heard Michelle's story of being at that meeting and how you came up to her, but there was, I'm sure, lots leading up to that point for you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Brenna, for inviting me. And it was really lovely to hear Michelle speak. Every time she speaks, I learn something new. So it doesn't seem to matter how many times. There's always something new. So the land that I live on is right near what was given to the Oneida Nation. It was my mother's land. If you can, the ownership of land is a very strange thing for me because I know that we don't own land. We do legally, but morally, we probably don't own land. But when my mother died in 2006, I inherited the land from her. And again, there are all sorts of details that I'm just going to skip over and to the main points. It's a beautiful land. It has trees, it has pasture land, it has cropland. It is farmed by a Mennonite farmer who is certified organic, which just thrilled me totally to have the land taken care of that way. There's a pond there and a stream, so there's water as well. And it is right behind the Quaker Meeting House. There is road frontage, but part of it is right behind the meeting house. And I didn't really know what to do with it. I didn't need the land. I have beautiful land that I live on here. And I pondered what to do. I looked into land trusts and there wasn't anything that really fit very well. And I just let it sit for a while. And then I heard about the possibility of a Haudenosaunee land trust that was taken to the Grand Council at Onondaga. And I knew that might or might not happen and could be decades or could be never. So I sort of had that in the back of my mind. As Michelle said, because of the political environment of the Oneida Nation, I was not really comfortable giving it to the Oneida Nation. So when Michelle spoke about the group of Oneida women from the 3 areas who were meeting and that they were looking for land, it was just like obvious. It was just obvious. And I went up to her right after the meeting and said, I have this land, and if you want it, it's yours. It was so clear that there's no other choice really. And it was perfect. It was just perfect.
Thank you. Yeah, something my mom would probably call that like a God moment or a spirit-led moment, sounds like, for maybe both of you. Would you be willing to share maybe some of either the education and experience or some of the spiritual and moral discernment as a Quaker that led to you thinking you would like to give land, return land to Oneida people or the people on whose land you lived?
Okay, sure. As I said in my bio, I did not know that much about Indigenous people on this continent until probably about 2011, 2012, when I heard about the two-row wampum renewal campaign, which was an enactment, a symbolic enactment of the two-row wampum. And actually there's a flag of the two-row wampum is there behind me. It shows a field of white with 2 rows of purple. One of the purple rows represents the Indigenous people with their laws and languages and culture. The other purple row is the Europeans with their laws and cultures and languages. This was the wampum belt that was created for the Dutch in 1613. And it was given by the Haudenosaunee to the Dutch, symbolizing the 2 rows traveling down the river of life together, side by side, without steering each other's vessel. So being in allyship, and I know that word is a little complicated, but with the Indigenous peoples of this land. And as the Haudenosaunee said, they have upheld their side of the bargain this whole time. But the neighbors of the Onondaga Nation, and then the Onondaga being another nation of the Haudenosaunee, and the Onondaga Nation came together to create this symbolic enactment of the two-row wampum renewal campaign. And I heard about it and I helped with organizing it. And that was in 2013, which was the 400th anniversary, 1613, of the original treaty. And we paddled down the Hudson River from Albany to New York City over 12 days, camping along the way, and just making great friendships between the native people and the non-native people, and having a really important experience together. So I learned an awful lot and developed a lot of relationships with that. And then soon after that, I went to a workshop that was on the doctrine of discovery called Roots of Injustice, Seeds of Change Towards Right Relationship to Indigenous Peoples. And that Buffy and I both went, experienced it, and was just blown away by the importance and of this kind of work, educating people to the history of native and settler relations in the last 500 years. The genocide, the land theft, the boarding schools, and it was definitely eye-opening. And as it said in my bio, Buffy and I have gone on to facilitate numerous workshops for this organization. And I see that Nuns and Nuns is going to do the workshop in January. That's great. Is that going to be online or in person?
Yes.
Online? Yeah, okay. And just learning all this, and with the knowledge that I was living on the Oneida homelands, made it really, the land is really special to me, and not because it's been special to people for a long time. And I can get choked up talking about this because I really love this land and the history of it and all that lives here. So just the importance of the land, I knew that it was important to me. And I can't imagine, I've only lived here 46 years. If it were that important to me, what about the people who had lived here for thousands of years? It must be incredibly important to them. And Michelle mentioned going out on the land and singing to it. And it was January, there was snow on the ground. But just singing to the land, and I probably will cry at this point because I always do. I just thought, how long has it been since the land has heard that song? And I knew, just as offering the land was right, that was a really special moment.
Thank you. Really beautiful to hear some of the experiences and deeply rooted beliefs that led you to this act. I know you have shared with me that a lot of the legal details were maybe a bit over your head, and that Michelle's group kind of took care of a lot of those, but was from your end, would you be willing to share just a little, like, I'm guessing you had to sign something at some point, just for those who are considering, well, what are the steps that they might need to take?
I am sure I did have to sign something, and there was one meeting, I think it was just one meeting in the lawyer's office, that way towards the end, I know that they have been taking care of it, and just put my faith in the fact that this was the right thing to do and that it would work out fine and that the lawyer would take care of everything that needed to be taken care of. So I had very little to do with the legal end of it. I think I did have to have the land surveyed.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess I did have to have the land surveyed, so that the boundaries were clear.
That just involved paying a surveyor, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
Thanks. And in a moment, I think I'll bring Michelle back up here to see, just to have you both talk about your relationship and how that's developed or what it's like now. But is there anything else you'd like to share that you wanted to share that I didn't ask you before we do that?
No, I don't think so. Something may come to mind, but
And there'll be plenty of time. We still have Q&A and everything too. So thanks, Leslie, so much for sharing your story. And welcome back, Michelle. Thank you. Yeah, I was wondering if you could maybe just share how your relationship has been since you met in 2017 or 18, as you said. And I know you each have each other's phone numbers. So yeah, what's it like? What's it been? How is it?
I think it's wonderful. I mean, we've had the opportunity to work together now as well. There's a project that the neighbors of the Onondaga Nation have been. It's not even just a project. It's this exercise. It's called the Witness to Injustice Blanket Exercise, and it was created in Canada as one part of the Truth and Reconciliation process. And so in short, it's called the Blanket Exercise. And so Lisa Lee and Buffy and myself and a whole other group of other folks from Onondaga Nation and members of Noon have come together and facilitated, these exercises. And it's been great because I feel like there's not just this connection, but a desire for continued education. And I think that becomes really, really important. And I think that we all recognize like the lack of education that exists within, the US educational system. But I think also one of the other stories too that I'd like to share is even though we did all this legal work, right, and all these documents were signed and it became official, but we also held a kind of like official dedication, which was really, really beautiful. And that was during the summertime. We invited, as many community members as we could. And I know Lisa Lee also invited, friends from the Quaker House to come and join. And so we all met there at the Quaker House because it's really beautiful because the Quaker House, is like right there at the land and has this big, beautiful picture windows that like looks out over onto the land. So we had this really just nice like dedication and words of exchange, between, our clan mothers and community members and between Lisa Lee. And it was just really nice. And then from there, we all gathered and we went out of the Quaker House and we danced down, and we did an Oneida dance, a traditional social dance, and we danced down onto the land. And it was really meaningful that day. And so I have this really beautiful picture. We have beautiful pictures from that day, but there's just this one that I love in particular, and it's of a young Oneida man. He's my cousin, and you can see him as like a profile picture, and he's like looking out onto the land, and you just see him in the land. And I just like, every time I look at it, I just like, to me, that represents the future. It represents, the vision of the future, and him like seeing, all the generations of our ancestors being connected there, but then being able to see the future generations and reconnecting to this land, and recognizing that it's really the people's determination or will and desire to reconnect and use the land and give thanks on the land. And so it's something really beautiful. It's one of the things that I wanted to share with you. I don't remember what your question was, Brenna, but I wanted to share that like beautiful image that comes to mind whenever I think about it.
Well,
That was a perfect answer to the question. Go ahead, Leslie.
I think that I actually had met Michelle. We may have even worked together before I heard her speak in Rochester. But it was after that we had lunches together. She would come see the land, we'd have lunch, she'd bring food, I'd have food, and just getting to know each other, getting to trust. I think I would guess, and Michelle, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but there was a lot of there would be a lot of questions that you would have. You know, is this for real? What is this? Is this still a real thing? And I think you actually asked me that on a couple of occasions when you would come with your sister or with your the elders who came, and we just got to know each other. And we have had lunch other places as well. It just, the connection has been a little skewed during COVID, as everywhere. But I have a great respect for Michelle and her work, and would love to spend more time with her.
Ditto.
Yeah, thanks. Just something that I wanted to reflect on just when preparing for this webinar on Tuesday. You know, I heard Michelle, you telling Leslie about this important Treaty Day event to be present for. So I got the sense there's definitely still a working relationship on making sure each other shows up for the activism that's still really important to the Oneida and people who live in New York. And it was beautiful to see that sort of back and forth.
There was a
Go
question
ahead.
I had asked that I had forgotten about, the things that words of wisdom. And I don't know whether you want to do that now or you want to save it for later.
Sure. Now would be a perfect time. I couldn't remember if I had given you that one in advance or if I didn't want to surprise you with it. So yeah, any words of wisdom that you have for Catholic sisters, people who are not Indigenous to the land, people who descend from settlers and immigrants who are thinking about maybe returning land or helping to repair the harm that's been done here in any way. Any words of wisdom that either of you can offer?
I would say that building relationships, and I think the first steps are always the hardest. Finding people who are Indigenous to the lands you live on, but finding them, building relationships over time, it's not going to be real fast. And if you do are able to transfer land, or you're thinking about it, it's probably a really good idea to have meetings with your neighbors, because neighbors don't always understand what's happening, and there can be concern or fear. I don't know what, it depends on your neighbors, but involving neighbors in some kind of a conversation about what this is, I think that could be really important. And also, one thing that I thought of that was important to me was no strings attached. No strings attached. That the settler colonizers have been attaching strings for too long, and we just can't do it.
Thank you. Strings attached. Thank you. Michelle, any words of wisdom from you to share or challenges to look out for?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that, you know, I'll just share, I'm going to share a couple of things, right? So, you know, the Onondaga Nation just received some land back, and I don't even remember who gave it. Maybe it was a corporation, I'm not sure, but it's really troublesome because the land, the earth is so polluted that it's not usable. I mean, that's like, in my opinion, probably one of the worst cases of what land back would look like. You know, it's like, oh, here, it's completely devastated and degraded that it you know, humans can't even walk on the earth, you know, because it's a health hazard. You know, that's a problem. And to believe that there's something good to come of that, I don't, yeah, I have a hard time personally seeing that. I think that's kind of like the worst of case scenarios. And so, you know, certainly that's to be avoided, right? If there's something that's seriously like, you know, big issues with the land. But, you know, I agree with Lisa Lee. I think relationships are really big. They're very important. And the two-row, you know, wampum treaty that she had pointed to over her shoulder there, I think is really essential. You know, learning the history of the country from, you know, the untold stories is so essential. And so as much as you can to educate yourself, because that history is there. You just have to really be willing to dedicate yourself to finding it, because it is there, and reconnecting with the communities. You know, even if you have to go to a powwow, right, to go like out there and meet with people and talk to folks and find out who's who, or if you've got like a nation or a tribe or a band that's near you, calling up their tribal office and just kind of, you know, introducing yourself and saying, you know, hey, I'm somebody here who's a neighbor. I'd like to learn more. You know, I'd like to, you know, develop, you know, some relationship. I'm sorry. I'd like to develop some type of relationship with, you know, the community. I'm even potentially looking, you know, to what to do with some of my land that I have, like whatever it is, right? You know, I think authenticity is key, because, you know, Lisa Lee might be able to also share with you that, you know, when we meet each other as Indigenous people, and even I'm sure she's received these questions too, is people want to know, who are you, right? Who are you? What's your intention? What's your people's history? What's your history on the land, right? Where are you from? You know, I know a lot of Americans can find that question offensive, but for us as Indigenous peoples, it's the first question we ever ask each other, even as our own people. It's like, hey, where are you from? Because we like to connect people to the lands that they're from. So and then we start to develop, well, maybe how are we related? How are we connected? It's about actual being in relationship with each other. And that's how you do it, is first by starting, where are you relationally with the land? And so don't be offended if you get asked that question, because it comes from a genuine place of wanting to make connection with you as an individual. I think always, you know, like, you know, making sure that, you know, you're sharing your most authentic and genuine self, you know, and it's never perfect. And, you know, being vulnerable sometimes is not easy. And sometimes, you know, we can get rubbed the wrong way, or we rub others the wrong way, and that's okay. It's okay. We're human beings, right? But we just have to be willing to put ourselves out there. And, you know, there is a very, very, very troubled history with this country. And, but I think being able to reconcile with it on some level and start to really talk about it is the only way we're going to find healing. And we have to know where we're coming from in order to know where we're going. And I think it becomes important to understand, well, what is the history and relationship in particular to where you currently live and the land that you're in relationship to? And if you're looking actually to, you know, whether it's give land back or whatever it is you're looking to do, you know, find out the history there. you can trace it. There's one woman who is from the Onondaga Nation who is managing a farm, and this land was given back to the Onondaga Nation, and the Onondaga Nation takes a very, different type of approach. They're not going to participate in federal, state government actions. And so, they're just using the land. They haven't done any sort of land transfer. They're not going to pay taxes on it, but they are using it. And they're just asserting their sovereignty over the land. But what her name is Angela Ferguson. You could look her up. She's done a lot of really wonderful work. But she actually just worked with local students at Cornell University. And she said, I want to know the full history on this land. Go look at every, land transfer, every deed. What did those people do? How did they come into possession of it? And she was able to trace it all the way back to a time of when a war came through and the land was illegally taken from them. So now she knows the lineage of what happened in regard to that particular land, even though her people knew that land was illegally taken. Now she can say, look, it was illegally taken. So now, if, the state or federal government wants to say, oh, well, what are you doing with the land? They're like, no, this is actually our land, right? And so, you can work with university students to, pull a lot of historical records for you, I think, which is so super important. And, taking a look at how did this land come to be where it's at today and historically what has happened. So again, like I said, there's a really, really tough, history to digest. And so be okay with tears, be okay with emotions, be okay with with the discomfort, because if anything, it will help us get to a better place of understanding and being able to understand Indigenous peoples today and where we're coming from, right? So one of the pieces of words of wisdom that I'll share is one of our chiefs. All of our chiefs and clan mother and faith keeper titles, they descend, and so their title, every time somebody passes, it's filled by somebody else for a lifetime position, but then they carried that same name of that chief or clan mother or faith keeper. And one of them, who is like the spiritual leader for the entire Haudenosaunee Confederacy, is called Tadadaho. And so the Tadadaho who was serving prior to our current one, his name was Chief Leon Shenandoah. And he's now in Sky World, so we would say Gaha, which means we're acknowledging, being, in Sky World. And so he was being interviewed one time, and the person was, really just asking about the history and this really tough history. And, was just thinking like, how can you be at peace, today? How can you, So the question he asked was, or the question the interviewer asked was, if you could wish away all non-native people again, and make this Indian land, because we're called Indians throughout history, which is problematic because we're not Indians, but that's the way the interviewer asked the question. He said, if you could wish away, all non-Indians and make this Indian land once again, would you do it? And his answer was no. And he said, because Creator sent everybody here for a reason. And I don't know what that reason is, but it's up to all of us to figure it out. And those words have been with me ever since I was 18 years old when he said them in the interview. And they've been a guidepost for me. And I think about it, and I know now we're at a time in our world where we have to figure that out. We don't have time anymore. We don't, time is precious. Our Mother Earth is telling us as human beings, we have to change our values, how we're living with each other, how we're living in relationship to the earth. And it's time. So, when I think about it, it's up to all of us to figure it out. We are at that time to figure it out, and it comes through action. We don't have a whole lot of time to sit and think and ponder. We got to take action. So those are my words of wisdom to leave you with today.
Oh my gosh, they're amazing words of wisdom. I feel like I could listen. I know I could listen to you forever. Yeah. So maybe we'll just take a couple minutes to let the rest of the folks on the call kind of digest some of what you said and process the information they've learned. We're going to let folks maybe just take about 3 or 4 minutes to think about what you've heard and maybe write down or just reflect on whatever works for you, some questions or thoughts that have come up for you or might be coming up for you. If there's questions, we'll end up probably having 10 to 15 minutes for you to be able to chat to Sarah Bradley if you have any questions you'd like us to pose to our speakers today. And those maybe just some prompts for you. If Sarah and Brittany are able to screen share, but if not, okay, great. How can you envision the concept of land rematriation taking form in your own community? What specific challenges would you or your community need help navigating in order to take concrete steps toward land return? Or anything else that has really hit you? Michelle and Leslie have given us a lot to think about. And there's Sarah. Send any questions to her and we'll maybe just take about 3 minutes here. Thanks so much for all who sent in your questions and for the reflection that you're doing on the inside too. There's several questions. I'm trying to decide which one to start with here. But there's one just that maybe I'll go. Yeah, maybe this is a kind of a more practical one that I'm guessing might be more for Michelle, but either of you, do you have any advice for white settlers, descendants of white settlers in navigating land return in contexts where official tribal leadership may not be aligned with like regenerative or reparative values? Seems like that's something that you just sort of went through yourself.
Well, I think in terms of making connection with community becomes important, right? So I'm not really sure like what community you're, speaking in relationship to. Like, do they have a big population that's nearby? Is it small, or you don't even really know where they are today? Like, right? There's all kinds of different scenarios. But talk to the women, talk to the elders, and you'll start to hear, kind of what's going on in the community. You can hear about, maybe some of the needs that are happening in the community as well. And, follow your instincts, I think is an important one, because remember, the land also has memory and has voice and has a deep connection to the people as well. And so I think that will also like instruct you. I think it's really about, following that. So if, just kind of like, Lisa Lee and I had talked about, like it was clear, like, giving it back directly to, the government, the Oneida Nation government, didn't necessarily feel right because there was concerns about developing the land, and so I would say from that level. So if there's like, like I said, like powwows happen, go to one. You hear of a community function, like in our area, we don't have powwows, but there's lots of things. There's like art shows that happen. There's different types of community events that the indigenous community will hold. Go to them, meet people, introduce yourself, start conversation, and it will lead you to exactly where you need to be. That's what I believe anyway. So Lisa Lee, maybe you have some advice on this too.
Not much else. There are cultural centers in a lot of places. The Indigenous museums can be a place to start. But yeah, meeting people and talking. I really like your advice about talking to the women and the elders.
Thank you. Yeah, and I know in some places there's Indigenous land trusts that are getting started or are already started, just to add to that. This is also probably mostly for Michelle, but Leslie, feel free to pipe in. But just wanted to ask a bit about, you just recently traveled to the Vatican as part of a a delegation of people to, among other things, demand an apology from Pope Francis for the Catholic Church's role, large role in the operation of the genocidal tactic of boarding schools. Would you be willing to share, and maybe however, what you'd like to share of that experience, what that was like for you, or also that there's I think a strong connection between boarding schools and the deliberate theft of as a way to deliberately steal land. Yeah, could you speak to any of that? Thank you for going.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So yes, I did go to the Vatican as part of this delegation. We were in a private audience with Pope Francis, and I served in the role of a spiritual advisor. One of our clan mothers had been asked to go, and she was not able to attend. So myself and another Mohawk sister went in her place, but I ended up being the one to speak to him, and I presented a empty cradle board to the Pope to reflect on overnight about all the lives of the children that were lost and the impacts on our family of these residential schools. And again, like, talking about contending with history is the recognition that, this didn't just happen in Canada, but it happened throughout the United States. And you can look into a report, an investigation that Secretary Deb Haaland has called for in looking at residential schools. And so you can already start to see some of the numbers that have come in, and there were more residential schools in the United States than there were in Canada. And already, there's a number that they've identified that have, unmarked graves of children at the schools. And so the United States has a lot of work to do in terms of recognizing this history. And there's a lot of desire to not want to look at it. And so we have to change that. So I think raising awareness, I think, is really important, but it's not just the residential schools. I mean, there's a lot. There's been just a, if you look at the thread does go back to the papal bulls that basically make up what's called this doctrine of discovery. And that was cited in the Oneida case, that the Sherrill versus Oneida case that I talked about earlier. And so that is cited in that case. If you look into the footnotes there, you'll see it, invoking the doctrine of discovery. And really what that says is that, the indigenous peoples in the Americas, not being Christian, didn't have souls, and we were just simply part of the flora and fauna, and therefore, the crowns of Europe could come to the Americas and claim the land and the resources in the name of all these crowns of Europe, and that's exactly what we saw happen. And with that, because the indigenous peoples were deemed as really not human, that enabled them to do whatever they like, from murder to rape and enslave indigenous peoples. But that also becomes the basis for land claim as well. And the Supreme Court, in the 1843 case of Johnson v. McIntosh, the doctrine of discovery becomes the basis for all claim to land within the U.S. territories. And it's just kind of like a one and done. That's it. Okay, doctrine of discovery. The United States can now claim all these lands. And, I like to remind people that the law informs the creation of policy, and policy informs the creation of education, and education informs socially how people will treat each other. And the fact that indigenous people's histories have not been included, as indigenous people, we know more about Western Civ and U.S. history than, as every other person, but people don't know our history or our collective history, right? And underneath it all, you have this view of the doctrine of discovery, which is really like one of our clan mothers likes to call it an illegitimate assumption of authority. or superiority, excuse me, illegitimate assumption of superiority. And you can really see it in education and policy that Indigenous peoples have been invisibilized. And because of that, that lens continues to pervade, it's pervasive throughout the Americas. That's why you don't hear about Indigenous peoples. We're not included in histories. We're not included on the news, or, demographic counts, or all of these types of things. And so people just don't see us. And that becomes important to see us. And so those are one of the things that I addressed with the Pope when I was there at the Vatican. And then when he came here to North America and was in Canada, that was something as well that was addressed with this doctrine of discovery. It becomes really important because it's at the core, it's at the foundation of colonization and how Indigenous peoples have been treated throughout these past 500 years. So I think understanding that really becomes very critical. And from my understanding, the Vatican is supposed to soon release a statement regarding the doctrine of discovery. I don't know what that will look like. I'm not really sure, because we really tried to get him to address it while we were at the Vatican. We also tried to get him to address it while he was here in Canada, and it wasn't. And I've been also doing a lot of work with the Conference of Canadian Catholic Bishops throughout these past several months to also have that addressed. And I can tell there's also like a real lack of understanding by a lot of the bishops in terms of understanding what that means. What are the legal implications on Indigenous peoples today because of that doctrine? I think becomes really important to also understand, because there, in the past, I do believe the church talked about not holding up this one papal bull that was I don't know if they use the word racist, but somewhere in the past had talked about it's not something that they stand by, but at the same time it's still part of active law here in the United States. So I think having one of the requests was to have the church to basically say, okay, we hereby forever revoke these papal bulls that contain and make up and hold up this doctrine of discovery, and to not allow any other nation state anywhere in the world to be able to rely upon this concept of doctrine of discovery becomes so important. So it's like taking responsibility for it. And I think for me, that was one of the important parts, because that allowed for the taking of all these children, right, to assimilate them. And, you can see what those results were. And it was really, really not good. And our people still feel the impacts of that today.
Thank you. Thank you. Gosh, there's so much here. I wish we had 2.5 hours. We just have a couple minutes left before we close. So I just want to maybe ask, there was a question that came in for what is your vision for this returned land, Michelle? And I know that maybe you're not as 100% involved with that particular piece of land, but just land return in general. Like where do you see land return? What's the vision? What's the overall vision?
Well, I mean, Lisa Lee had brought up an important point that, land ownership is something for Indigenous people that we don't really see it about land ownership. It's, it's about being stewards of the land, being in connection with the land. So even though I haven't been formally, active within the nonprofit that is, managing the land, again, I will forever be connected to it because it's Oneida land. So I will still be connected. My family, the generations will still be connected to the land. So it's not necessarily about who formally manages or owns or whatever, has the deed to it. But I think in terms of, land and whether we're talking about land back or anything, really, I think right now we're at this time, it's about how are we living in relationship to the land and how are we treating the land, regardless of who's managing it. I think that's the biggest part. And I think access is key, right? Like allowing Indigenous people to be in a space where we have the full autonomy to access the lands and to use them and connect, just in the way that Lisa Lee had mentioned before about, the first time we sang to the lands, and that these lands haven't heard these songs in 200 years. That connection is important. Within our way, we give thanks. I mentioned this at the beginning, that we have ceremonies, and those, it's all about giving thanks, and it's reciprocity. And in our way, we know the trees are alive, the grass is alive, the water is alive, water sustains us. And as long as we are giving thanks to them, it's a reciprocity. We have to give thanks to the water in order for the water to continue to be there to sustain us. And so if we can recognize that, creating space, whatever it is, gifting back, land back, whatever it is, or even yourselves treating the land, with great respect and reverence, I think becomes really, really important, especially for our future and our future generations.
Thank you. Wow. Couldn't imagine better closing words. Thank you. Yeah, we're coming to time here. I'm sorry for there's a couple more questions I think that we were just not able to get to. But hopefully you continue, all of you, to come to future events, and maybe as we go in this together, some of those questions will be answered. Just a reminder today that let's see, that like all of Nuns and Nuns Land Justice Project's educational programs, this program was free of charge, but we are compensating our speakers. So if, in keeping with the spirit of repair, we encourage everybody on here to contribute money to the Indigenous nation on whose land you currently dwell, or to an Indigenous-led organization that's working to heal land and people. I'm seeing lots of great comments coming in. What a powerful and beautiful time together. Thank you so much. I'm sure that lots of prayers will be with both of you as you move forward in all of your important work and loving of the land. And yeah, a reminder that our upcoming, in 2 weeks, on both October 26th and 27th, the Nuns and Nuns Land Justice team is partnering with the Center for Ethical Land Transitions to bring you a first of its kind custom designed workshop on cultural sensitivity for land justice collaborations. So if you're interested in participating in some form of land back or some other kind of land justice, this workshop is really for you. It's necessary that you come to both parts. Attendance is required at both sessions, but this workshop will focus on ways communities can approach collaborations with dispossessed peoples from a stance of solidarity and repair. Leslie had mentioned earlier, no strings attached. How can we do that well and in a spirit of solidarity and repair? So you can register for that and other upcoming programs at nunsandnuns.org/landlearning. And just another huge thank you to both Michelle and Leslie for giving us so much of your time today. And there's some additional resources. Michelle's website, rematriation.com. You can find more information there, and also the Nuns and Nuns Land Justice Guidebook on land back, and we have 2 other guidebooks as well, but today was sort of focused on land back. You can find it at nunsandnuns.org/imagine. So yeah, feel free to put any of your gratitude and thanks in the chat. And we'll close with that. Thank you again so much, Michelle and Leslie. And Michelle, if you don't have time, it's fine. There was somebody on here who had a little specific question for you. Somebody from Oneida territory here in Wisconsin. So I'm wondering if you might be willing to talk to him, or if you need to go.
Sure, I can stay for just a couple of minutes, but I'd be happy to.
Okay, thank you so much. I think Antonio, there was someone here. If you want to take yourself off mute, you had a sort of particular question.
Yeah, Segu. I just wanted to congratulate you on all the work that you've been doing and all the achievements that you had the last few years in working for our people. I mean, it's really amazing. You actually inspired me to seek this partnership and contact Nuns versus Nuns, because I I inherited a nonprofit here in the city of Milwaukee from a Catholic nun. So I'm looking to try to get some land, some space so that we can have, a traditional garden, so we can do some of our ceremonies so that we can gather. What kind of partnerships would you think that I would need to have that, whether it's with other religious groups, with other business groups that would help accomplish that, do you think?
Well, yeah, it's nice to see you. I'm happy to hear that. You have this nonprofit, and nice to meet you. So yeah, for starters, I mean, it's so hard because I think, for myself, one of the things I've learned is that, I have these ideas about all the things that I think that I need, and it's good to have an idea. I mean, we always need legal help, and you're talking about the land. I mean, I'm just gonna, I think, give some examples, and not necessarily ones that we've just used directly in Oneida, but if you're talking about like growing, I'm just going to refer to Angela Ferguson with the Onondaga Nation Farm. She does a lot to educate other farmers around the area about the two-row relationship. And, when they've had big, community functions and they brought people in from all over the world for lacrosse games and stuff, she went around and said, hey, it's all of our responsibility to feed all these people who are coming here. And all these farmers donated food and helped out. And but it's like, just kind of like what Lisa Lee was saying with, the neighbors, getting them to see if they're interested in contributing. One of the things that Angela has done is, like, in her conversations with people, like, she discovered that, there was a farmer nearby who had all these maples on his territories or on the lands, and wasn't able to continue to keep up that. And so she pulled together a whole group of people from Onondaga, and they went up and tapped all the trees, and otherwise they would have missed out on that resource. And one thing that she does is she always contributes all the food back to the community. So whatever it is that they grow, they're contributing it back. Again, just, I always think that legal piece is always important. So building relationship to that. And also people to tell the story. That is so big and so important. Put the young people to work, have them turn on their cameras and, create short videos, or have people that can write, putting the story out there. As much as you can tell the story about what you're up to, people will come to support it. I also think about, like, grant writing, especially if you have a nonprofit, if you've got that, that legal status to be able to apply for grants that are out there. There's lots of grants that are out there that are helping Indigenous based, whether it's like food growers, food sovereignty, connect with some of the, the folks who are out there, like, making films. You can find them out there on social media. Just stay connected to them and bring in young people as well, because I think the more also that we can, like, get our young people involved, I think is so important. Just let the experience be our teacher, so yeah. But good to meet you, and stay connected. Reach out to us at Rematriation. We'd love to be able to, share what you're all up to, and also help to, highlight some of the work you're doing too.
Okay, Yawanko, Anakiwa.
Yeah, Nikiwa.